Hello, I'm your host, Effie Pilarino, and today we have the pleasure of having another brilliant woman with us that I had the pleasure to be with her recently in Zurich. I'd like to welcome Marie Walker. Thank you, Marie, for making the time to be with us.
Thank you, Effie. Absolute pleasure to be with you and to meet you in Zurich. I'm a huge fan. I've been following you for ages, so it was a delight on both fronts.
And what an event organized by the Open Wealth Association. You know, you are one of the important people, not only thinking, but acting on making open data, open finance a reality. And you're very not only passionate about it. I must mention that you are, except your professional standing with Raidiam, you are also the curator of openconversations.org, right? Maybe tell us a little bit about that. What's your focus? And most importantly, what are the top reasons that you are passionate and you believe that open data in financial services is a major thing?
Yeah, okay, great. Well, how long have we got? I could talk about this for hours, and I'm sure I'm accused of that often. So, yes, open conversations. I have to keep myself up to date with what's going on around the world for various reasons, professionally, but also the pro bono work that I do. And a while ago, I started sharing what I was reading on a daily basis, what I thought were the really interesting news stories and articles. And people who followed me on LinkedIn were appreciative of that. And eventually they said, it's thank you very much, Marie, for posting lots of articles throughout the day. But could we just please have a list once in the morning? And then we can just read that and then we'll know what's going on. So I basically started this news feed called Open Conversations, which is also searchable for any of the keywords. So you can search for what countries are doing, companies, topics, use cases, and so forth. So it's become a bit of a passion project. But because of the visibility that gives me on what's happening around the world, I was also asked by Cambridge University to write the market progress module of their course for regulators, which I teach. So that's teaching regulators about open banking and open finance. And then, as you say, I have a day job with the technology company Raidiam, who enable this with core infrastructure. And that gives me practitioner insights as well. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm coming from in terms of why it's important and why I feel so enthusiastic about the direction of travel. It really comes down to, firstly, the principle behind all of this is about customers, its citizens and businesses having access to their whole data self so that they can leverage what is known about them and their behaviors and their aspirations, particularly aspirations when it comes to things like wealth, and enabling them to get access to better and more appropriate products and services. So, a very good relatable example is if you have somebody who has a non-traditional earning pattern, for example, they might work in the gig economy, they can't get access to traditional finance. So, they can't get mortgages and pensions, and they find it hard perhaps to get a loan. But if you can see all of their financial self over a prolonged period of time, then banks can lend against that. They can assess the risk much better. They can provide income smoothing business banking, for example. So it's the right thing for customers. The consumer data right, as is spoken about in Australia, is another way to think about it. So that's one thing. It's just the right thing to do. Secondly,
It's
customers are getting
financial inclusion, the way you
exactly.
right in the sense not of the unbanked, but really the underbanked, and there's many degrees of being underbanked, whether you're an individual, as we mentioned the example, or a business of small or medium size.
Yep, absolutely. So, and it's not just unbanked and financial inclusion in emerging countries. A lot of people think that this is a third world issue. There's a huge percentage of unbanked in the UK. Other issues around financial inclusion and unbanked are things like debt management. So people who get into debt, some of them can find it very difficult to get themselves out of it. They ignore the problem. It's a worry. They don't understand it. They can't see their path forward. So having somebody being able to see all of the debt that they have and work out a way of managing it or managing affordability of future credit, these are all things that this helps. So from a premise that the data belongs to the customer, it's the right thing to do. We'll also see customers demanding this. So there are changes coming in laws on data privacy all around the world, on consent management and so forth. So doing right by your customer is one aspect. The fact that they're going to start demanding it is another. Regulators are also starting to make this a requirement. But even aside from that, if you as a business serving customers aren't keeping this in mind when you're building your products and services or the way that you engage with your customers, you're going to have a very tough time in the future because other companies who have appreciated that this is a transformative trend in the world, you'll suddenly find that you will be struggling for market share. And it might not be the same competitors that you've always benchmarked yourself against. It might be somebody completely different. The transport sector, the taxi sector, they didn't see Uber coming, but Uber, as we know, has been a huge success. So I think it's a combination of the right thing to do, recognition that this is what customers will want, and then you've got the commercial and strategic and regulatory drivers.
Yeah, and from the perspective of businesses, the financial services providers, be it a fully licensed bank or, in Europe, a payment provider, whoever is providing this, it is clear that the lines are blurring of, what business am I in and what can I offer. And as that those boundaries are blurring, you need APIs to link and grow, whether you're growing a platform, a marketplace, or whatever ecosystem strategy you have. And there's no other way than starting to transform your business as if you are a fully open business in the future. And I always like to bring to the highlight what the Jeff Bezos did back in 2002. That's 22 years ago, where he put out this, it's called an API manifesto to Amazon, which at the time was not the complex ecosystem we know today, but he mandated everybody to communicate internally only with APIs and to make sure that these APIs are externalizable if needed. And at the end, he signed apparently the memo saying, if you don't do this, you will be fired. And this is really the infrastructure he laid for what we know today as this platform-based ecosystem, which is probably the most complex one that we know in the Western world. And it seems to me that you're trying, you and everybody who's in this open finance and open data movement are trying to convince everybody that we are going towards this world, and this is the competitive advantage, whether the regulator comes and tells you, obligates you to do so or not.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really interesting to see how far we've come with hearts and minds in the finance sector. So when open banking first came, it was seen as a competition remedy. And in the UK, the biggest account holding banks and building societies were told you are going to do this by this deadline to this standard, and you're going to pay for it. So they had no choice. And paying for it was quite painful because the UK was doing it technically as well. So they were very prescriptive about how this was going to happen. And nobody had done it before. So it was a complicated long and expensive project. But fast forwarding to now, there isn't really a jurisdiction around the world that isn't looking at doing this, but they are doing it in varying degrees of mandating it or allowing the market to drive it or doing a combination of both. What's interesting is that we're starting to see the banks asking for it. So, I mean, at the very early days, I remember talking to the head of a French bank, the head of open banking for a French bank, and he was very happy to tell me that his APIs existed and were conformant with the regulations, but they weren't very good. So good luck connecting to them. There was this real protectionism going on. It's our data and it's a competitive advantage for us, and we don't want to share. Now, people in banks, in particular, speaking about finance, really see the opportunity. And in countries where they are not having any centralized infrastructure provided by the regulator, we're seeing the Banking Association wanting to stand up that infrastructure to help the ecosystem to flourish. In the UK, the mandate has ended for the first phase of open banking, but the regulator, the Financial Conduct Authority, has written to the 40 largest users of open banking in the UK and asked them to voluntarily fund it, the development into open finance for the next 3 years. And they have got that funding. So there's a real recognition that, yes, this is something that we have to do because this is the direction of travel, but also it's an opportunity. We want to do it. And what I always say as well is that people say it's still very early, it's unproven, you can't make any money out of it, etc. It is very early, and if you look at other large transformative technologies like mobile phones or the internet or contactless cards, it does take a long time. But you don't need to just look at creating value in terms of a brand new product or service. If you think about every aspect of what open consent-driven data can do for your business, there are huge advantages in meeting your ESG responsibilities or transforming your treasury management. And all of these incremental benefits you can get as a business from what is happening beyond what you're actually offering to your customers could be the difference between profitability or non-profitability, etc. So it's a very complicated and deep-rooted transformation that affects every aspect of a business.
You already mentioned about this market-driven versus regulatory-driven open banking or hybrid. I always think of the US as the example that started as a market-driven situation or example, if you want. And now they're probably becoming a bit hybrid. What give us some examples that you sort of like around the globe that show what is happening, how banks or incumbent institutions are really actually taking advantage of open banking, or examples of partnerships that you really like to bring forward as examples and possibilities for others to consider.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the biggest user groups or where the potential is very high are small businesses. So we mentioned right at the beginning that access to credit for your small and micro business layer is absolutely transformative for economies and societies. So also small business owners are very quick to adopt anything that will save them money and time. So they're much quicker to see the opportunity. And the services and use cases that have evolved around small businesses have gained a lot of traction. So accounting software providers now all have open banking integrations for automatic reconciliation. I think that when we get embedded payments into smart contracts that automatically trigger a payment at the due date, I mean, that's going to be for any, I mean, how that works in terms of the politics, who knows? But that is a massive advantage for small businesses. And then on the consumer side, it's making life better for them. So I love the concept of self-driving finance, where you bring AI in and the access to the data in order to assist people with decisions that they're making. So, or the process that they're going through. An example would be embedded insurance. So embedded products are not open banking per se. It's simply putting the finance or the insurance into the customer journey at a contextually appropriate time. But if the service that's being offered as an embedded insurance product, for example, is using data from the platform it's embedded into, then you can start really seeing some advantages. So the one I love is a company called Blink Parametric, who have embedded their insurance, travel insurance, into where you buy your flight. And if your flight is delayed and you've got flight delay cover, it automatically triggers a payout. You don't have to apply and you don't have to prove it. So it's things that make life easier and better for the customer, I think, that's when we're going to start seeing adoption. It's people don't need to know what open banking is, they just need to know that it is easier for them. Also, examples of complex solutions. So I love the work being done by the Open Property Data Association in the UK, who are looking at digitizing the whole home buying process. And I know that there are other parts of the world that have been working on this or doing this as well. But again, it's that concept of having a multi-entity transaction, multi-party transaction, assigning identity once to the participants and then relying on, say, the bank to verify that identity at different parts in the transaction. And the whole process makes it quicker and cheaper and less risky. There are so many examples, in terms of process improvements, access to a richer variety of data sources in an API framework for underwriting insurance. Underwriting is a difficult, complex project activity,
Yeah.
which adds to the cost. We're all paying for our insurance. So if there's a better way of doing it, a more reliable way of doing it, then that reduces costs for everybody. So there's an absolute myriad of examples and use cases that, I think make it such an exciting area to be working in. And we can see that interoperability is coming between different sectors and different borders. It's not a technical problem, it's a policy problem. But when we've cracked that, then you really can get the same products and services wherever you are traveling in the world from your existing suppliers, etc.
Yeah, property and buying, selling property, whether it's residential or commercial, is a great example. Instead of the traditional or old times where you only went to the bank when you'd done all that journey and made the decision and you needed the financing, the mortgage. Instead of that, now you can imagine the financial services provider supporting you through that journey until that final transaction, which is the financing,
Mm.
and offering a superior customer experience. And as you already mentioned, that reduces the overall cost to the economy because of the flowing of data.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, and making life easier for customers as well. So things like using the details that your financial providers have on you to automatically verify your identity or complete forms for you. All of these things take a lot of the pain and economic wastage out of doing things. It just lubricates life in a very appreciable way. So one of the things that banks were worried about with open banking was account switching, but that really hasn't happened. However, the relationship that they have with their customers, the primary relationship, there is a risk that that can be diluted if your customer is accessing the bank through a different provider, like a wallet, for example. So again, it's in that situation, you can't do anything about that. If your customer wants to use Apple Wallet to do their banking, you've got no chance of changing that. But what you can do, and I think this is hugely positive, is concentrate on the experience the customer has when they reach you. So the making it really easy for them to do business or to live and manage their finances, and making sure that they get a fantastic experience when they are within your offering. And I think that that as a competition remedy, pushing banks and financial services companies to always think client first and always think about how can we improve this, even if it's just a small incremental improvement. How can we make it slightly better? I think that's a really positive step from where we were maybe 20, 30 years ago, where banks basically, the feeling was that the bank held the power and you were just taking part in the finance that they provide and you didn't have any opportunity to really change or influence anything. I think now listening to customers and really trying to excel is a very positive outcome from this.
Yeah, there is a lot of opportunity for banks, especially when we think beyond the plain vanilla consumer products of payments. When we start going into credit products, there's a huge range, wealth, asset management products where clients need more hand holding, have questions, there's opportunities to interact, to inform, to educate, to provide alternative solutions. That's where financial services providers need to figure out how to have that germany, those touch points with the client, whether it's through a wallet or whatever the interface is, in order to offer value and be there, and also be there for clients when there are troubles and
Mm,
issues to resolve, which we have seen through the digitalization process that everybody loves, no interaction with the bank or the provider. But when there's a problem, when you have a question, when you need something, revised, customized, you do want to be able to talk to somebody. And how do you do that? Again, at a lower cost to make it scalable. I think there's a lot of problems and challenges and opportunities for banks to
mm,
to serve customers. Although, as you said, the interface might be a wallet, and you don't see the financial services provider there. I think that's an important thing.
mm.
Mary, I want to ask you about, it seems to me that the technology that is core to all these are APIs, and APIs are not as hot as generative AI. They've been around, they are evolving, but I think API is how all this can happen. The issue is, how do we harmonize the standards, whether open banking is market-driven or regulatory imposed? What are your thoughts there? Where are we at globally? How big a problem is the harmonization of these APIs? Because we do live in a global cross-border economy.
Yeah. Well, the good news is that there's been a lot of work on API standards so far. So there is a dominant security standard that's emerged called FAPI, which stands for the Financial Grade API. That is a significant step up in terms of security for API data sharing because it uses asymmetric keys and secrets. So traditional security protocols were keys and secrets. So you have a username and you have a password. But with asymmetric keys and secrets, with the FAPI standard, it's mutual authentication. So your bank has to authenticate itself to you as the customer, as well as you authenticating yourself to the bank. Gives a lot more certainty that you're dealing with somebody you actually mean to deal with. So this is the principle of things like confirmation of payee as well, making sure that we can reduce fraud and bad actors by making sure that there's total certainty of person A and institution B are exactly who they say they are.
This
so
is
that
how pay by bank or account to account payments are scaling and working more and more.
Yeah, so yeah, the security protocol I think is really important. There is also a standard now for interoperability. So when we're talking about globalization, the OpenID Federation standard has been written to allow for federated ecosystems to interact with each other. So that is a step forward, and we should next year see an example. There's going to be a POC of wholesale banking markets interacting with each other, four different ones. So that's coming. In terms of the other sort of standards that you're building to, I think there's a lot of progress, but there's still different API standards around the world. So when we start getting to more interoperability cross-border or cross-sector, that's when we'll see the work being done on those. At the moment, there isn't harmony, but there is a big swell of opinion and enthusiasm to get to that endpoint. The other thing around API standards that's really important with the ecosystems we have already is making sure that the APIs conform exactly to the standard. If you have any degree of variance, the API call won't work, and that introduces friction. It means that the consumer won't get the result that they've asked for, and it means that the data relying party, the data receiver, won't get their API call answered by the data provider. So that affects innovation, it affects the health of the ecosystem, and it affects the ability to scale. We're seeing in Europe there hasn't been any, well, including the UK, there hasn't been any conformance program to the API standards, and that has stifled growth. In Brazil, there is a very robust conformance program. So all of the APIs in the Brazilian ecosystem, open finance ecosystem, of which there are about 1,000 entities participating, all of those APIs are being rigorously tested every single week to make sure they exactly comply. So everything just works. So that's a
That's
key
done
enabler.
by the regulator. This is
It's so The company I work for, Raidiam, provides the trust framework technology that enables all of the entities to discover each other's APIs and then securely connect to them and be authenticated and authorized. So it's an access management layer. Within that, the capabilities, the conformance testing is being taken place on a daily basis.
so you would say that if we look globally, that Brazil is one of the top countries where this harmonization of APIs or the standards is working very well.
Very much so. So the Brazilian ecosystem is a massive success story in terms of data sharing. The statistics are quite remarkable. They currently have about 1.5 billion API calls per week. And if we compare that to the UK last year had about 13 billion in the whole year, which was a significant improvement or increase on Europe. If you look, I think PwC did a study looking at France, Germany, Spain, and one other country, and the API calls were in the sort of 3 billion mark. One of the reasons why the UK has a much higher total was it was more regimented in terms of how it enabled open banking, and it provided core technology, but also they've used payments, account to account payments, for things like paying your tax. So in the UK, you can't pay your tax bill any other way. So the number of API calls for paying tax has skewed our results slightly. The other thing that's interesting when we start thinking about progress and who's gone further and faster and so forth is that it's not possible to really rely on the figures very well as an indicator of market penetration. The figures tell us the number of instances of API calls, but they don't tell us how many users were behind that. So it's likely that the early adopter users are making multiple calls. So in the UK, we recently talked about having 10 million users, but that was 10 million API calls as opposed to people. So it's still quite early in terms of justifying things like value versus cost, certainly statistically. But it is undeniable. I spoke recently to the credit scoring company Experian, and they have a product called Boost, and they've been able to reach something like 35% more customers with their credit scoring services, their products, access to credit, than they were able to previously. because having that bigger picture of their customers means that they were more credit worthy and less of a risk to lend against.
But Experian is providing an API to others
Yes.
to
Yeah.
access their experience,
Yeah, exactly.
credit, the history and data that enables others to make credit decisions.
Yes, absolutely. And this API economy, this for data sharing, it's not just restricted to finance. So there's a huge amount of work being done in the telecoms industry who have this open gateway project to provide a universal API for access to mobile network operators' data to do things like reduce instances of fraud. So to protect customers' location data, for example. We've seen in the UK there's a move to provide consumer consent to sharing energy data. There's all sorts of, I was talking this morning with somebody who's working on a European deforestation program using APIs to determine the provenance of timber and making sure that the timber is sustainable and being replanted and so forth. So there's such a body of work around APIs for accessing data, and it also isn't just about accessing data as in sharing data in like packets of data being shared. It's also accessing API calls to verify credentials. So like your age, for example, if you want to buy some alcohol, or that you are who you say you are if you're wanting to pay somebody with your banking app and so forth.
Yeah. Verification, provenance. I can imagine, in supply chain, in logistics, that of course in the end will connect somehow to financial services, but there's a whole other part of economic activity before that that is also enabled through APIs. And as always, financial services are behind the economic activity, not necessarily in front. It's only us, we think, we are focused on financial services, but really it's about, why is this happening, right?
Yeah. Somebody, I forget who it was, but somebody said open banking is not special, it's just first. And the reason it's first is that it affects so much of life. The financial data, as you say, is threaded into everything we do, and it's highly regulated. So it had all the conditions that were right to open up. I mean, open was the wrong term. Everybody accepts that it shouldn't have been called open. And it also confuses people if you start talking about open data, because open data in traditional terms is open source data. So accessing any data, but not with the consent of the customer and not being personalized. So there are a few terminology issues that will probably change over the coming years. But yes, a data economy driven by APIs is absolutely the direction of travel.
And if we think of, the next phase, which is going to be an intelligent data economy or smart, whatever you want to call it, going from the digital economy, the experience economy towards that, it definitely needs this piece to empower it of
Mm.
openness, because otherwise it's impossible to move to smart and intelligence, whatever it means, and how we decide to develop it with what privacy guardrails and policies and regulations. This is the world that we are heading to, and hopefully we will go there in a way that is beneficial to everybody, the end consumers, the businesses, and the entire economy.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is what regulators around the world are looking at, and not just the financial regulators. So I think the concept that the data belongs to the individual, whether that's a business or a citizen, I think that really has gained such traction in the last few. And all of the regulators that I see on the Cambridge course or meet in person at events and so forth, they're not looking at whether they should do this. They're looking at when and how, and appropriately sizing it for their market. And some countries that have smaller markets, they're looking at what role they can play in their region to increase opportunity for their economy and their society as well. So, there's an ambition to become this global economy, and global citizens that I haven't seen before. It's also very interesting that recently I've had various conversations with banks, and other providers who have started talking about their data in strategy. So it's not just about how they can serve their customers with the products and services they have themselves and how they can make sure that they are securely answering API calls that their customers ask them to. It's about how can they bring data, how can they access other people's data, other innovative use cases into their business as well. So I think that recognition of the value that this creates really, really has taken several big steps forward in the last sort of 12 months.
Very interesting. So to conclude and close, I'm hearing from you that there has been a significant mindset shift, both in the regulatory environment amongst regulators, how to think about policies going forward, and also by banks wanting to sort of open up and maybe have access through APIs to data that they never had access before, and combining them to create new services or serve their customers better. That's brilliant. I really love that. Mary, thank you so much. Thank you for being with us and sharing your insights and your experience.
Thank you very much for having me.